Good morning. What a great turnout. 10 o'clock in the morning. We were obviously all in bed very, very early last night. Welcome to Bursting the Southern White Bubble. Yes, well, we have yet another ex-Etonian Prime Minister in office. Is the media still similarly run by a white, male, wealthy elite who gets to decide what we watch, who makes it, and handing only token means of expressions to others? That's one of the key things. The stats would certainly suggest that for creative industry supposedly leading the way in bringing new stories and perspectives to our screen, why is it actually so hard to change? And what are the far-reaching effects for our society of leaving so many voices unheard? You've been posting questions at the Festival app, got lots of them here. I'll definitely be using these, but we're going to real live hands up with real live questions in the third part of the discussion as well. You can post them anonymously, you can say who you are, but keep posting anyway. And joining me to try and fix the problem and start a revolution are the leading on-screen talents, commissioners, and indeed producers. Cherylee Hoosein is an actor best known for playing Izzy Armstrong in ITV's Coronation Street. She was diagnosed with Ehlers-Danlos syndrome at the age of 24 while she was at drama school. And May this year, she co-founded DANK. Sounds a bit weird, DANK, but we know what it is. It's the Disabled Artist Network Community for Connections and Advocacy, anything but DANK. And Cherylee also stars in the series Tinsel Girl, a fictionalised version of her own experiences to air for its fifth instalment on BBC 4. Nish Kumar is alongside stand-up comedian. He is a frequent voice across radio, TV, and indeed in the Guardian newspaper, and he's just finishing a run of Edinburgh nights for the BBC at the festival. Most recently, he starred alongside fellow comic Joel Dommett in the Comedy Central travelogue Joel and Nish versus the World. He hosted his own satirical spoof shows, The MASH Report for BBC Two, which you'll all be delighted to hear is coming back. Marcus Ryder is based in Beijing as the Chief International Editor of CGTN News Digital, China Global's television network, overseeing the English language digital content of the Chinese national broadcaster. I just think it's a very interesting time to be doing that job. Previously, he was head of current affairs at BBC Scotland for almost a decade, winning numerous awards, and also oversaw the coverage of the independence referendum. That's the first? No, it's the independence referendum. There may be another, may not. Marcus is a leading figure in the efforts to increase diversity in the media, including co-coordinating the campaign for film and television diversity tax breaks to increase representation of women, ethnic minorities, and people with disability working in the industry. Aisling O'Connor started her new job on Monday. She's only been in the job for 4 days.
Give me a
So she has just been appointed head of TV commissioning for BBC England with a brief to reinvent the TV offer for the BBC England audience. She's based in Birmingham and works across England. Amongst her roles as music and arts commissioning executive of BBC Two and BBC Four, she looked after programmes as wide-ranging as The Secret of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony to Quizium with Griff Rhys-Jones. In her new role, Aisling says she wants to avoid stereotypes of class and region and celebrate England, looking for content that makes us proud to be English, where she feels people aren't allowed often to be English. So we'll be asking what it means to be English. Bilaal Hoosein, delighted to have you here. You're based in Qatar. In fact, we're just saying the Al Jazeera stand here is the best one, of course, because it's the front one we all go, we'll just go to the Al Jazeera stand. It's advertising you couldn't even pay for, really. And he's director of programmes, but not much, of Al Jazeera English, with commissions including documentaries and talk shows. And he has been working in the media for more than 20 years, beginning his career as a news cameraman and video editor, covering the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, and also owning his own production company. And he was raised in apartheid South Africa. So delighted to have Bilaal too. Kat Lewis, no stranger to this conference, founder and CEO of the Manchester Indie Nine Lives Media, with output including docs, Fact Ent, current affairs and children's programmes. Passionate about equal opportunities, Kat's company employs a high diverse team at all levels of job. 30% from different backgrounds, high percentage of staff with disabilities, and to quote her, we need to use the brains and voices of the whole country because the talent is out there. Welcome to our panel. Now, taking a bird's eye view from Beijing, Marcus, does a southern wealthy male white industry elite still get to run the show with a bit at the fringes of others?
Yes, let's go home. Okay, so yes and no. I'd say I would tweak that question just a little bit and say my answer would be a southern wealthy white male culture elite runs the industry.
And why do you add in culture?
Because take Dorothy Byrne's excellent McTaggart speech. She said it was a woman exec who sent her out to film with somebody who she knew was going to sexually assault her, right? So it was a woman who sent her out, right? And so what we need to do is make sure that we do not just get into a debate with regards to HR numbers. We need to actually look at the culture because black people, women, disabled people, a few of us, and it is a few if you look at the numbers, can make it into those higher gatekeeper roles. But unless we actually change the culture, unless we empower them and enable them, right, nothing will actually change. We'll see a browning, or we'll see a few more people in wheelchairs, or we'll see a few more women. But unless we actually change the culture, nothing will change.
But when you were head of current affairs at BBC Scotland, how did you work to change the culture?
Okay, I'll give you I changed the culture by having power and money, right? So I'll give a real quick panorama example. I had a award-winning, well, I thought it was going to be award-winning, documentary. I went down to London to pitch it to Panorama commissioners. They said, it's good, I can see why you think it's going to be award-winning. There was, in 3 parts, one part was very, very Scottish. And they said, could you take out the Scottish bit, right? And they didn't say it as directly, they didn't say take out the Scottish bit, but the bit they wanted to be taken out said, to make it, I mean, I understand why it might appeal to your Scottish audience. They said it as condescendingly as that. I understand why it might appeal to your Scottish audience, but for a broader audience, Marcus, maybe concentrate on these 2 elements, right? Because I had the power and money and backing of Ken Macquarie back in Scotland, we knew this was coming up, and we knew we could finance it ourselves, and we knew we could just play it in Scotland if need be. And so I had the confidence, the power, and the money to say no. If I didn't have that, if I was any independent, I would have had to have done that. The programme went out with Scotland. Panorama had to accept it with the Scottish element.
So the Scottish element went out on network?
Absolutely, and it won awards.
Great, well, that's a really good example.
But the point is, right, if I didn't have money and an independent distribution, right, to have gone to as an alternative, that bit would have gone out. That would, and on pure HR numbers, they would have said, well, you've got a Scottish producer, you've got a Scottish AP, you've got a Scottish, on HR numbers, it was a Scottish production.
Nish, what was your experience of the southern male white bubble?
Well, I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? Because I come from a background of absolutely unfiltered live performance. I mean, there are gatekeepers when you work in the live area, and this the festival that's happening at the moment in this city is in a process of introspection about how those gatekeepers can either be circumnavigated or have a kind of cultural and systemic change. My experience of it's not even as pernicious as outright prejudice. There is simply an assumption that the default is a southern middle-class cisgendered heterosexual white man. And it's not even that, a lot of the time when you communicate with gatekeepers, it's not even that they are actively trying to keep those numbers. It's just an assumption of the default, and everything else is a deviation from the norm. And so the problem with that is that you sort of end up in this situation with a very homogenous culture. And there is an assumption that those are the correct, and I mean, I think something that has worked, and it was crudely handled, I think, at the time, but something that has worked in terms of a discernible cultural shift in the cultural television comedy was in 2014, an edict was issued by the BBC that insisted that the comedy panel shows have one woman on them, right? Which, in retrospect, is...
It's just laughable.
Well, you say that. Several of my male colleagues, for want of a better term, lost their fucking minds. Like, absolutely.
Be Dorothy. Be Dorothy.
Yeah,
name names.
I mean, to be honest, there's a couple of them that I'd rather not dignify by giving them a publicity boost for their dog shit careers by mentioning them. But people lost their minds. Now, what you're now seeing and it was crudely handled, and it put a lot of the first wave of women that went onto those shows in a really difficult position and put them in the firing line. The culture has now shifted, and now it would be, it would sort of be considered unacceptable to have a comedy panel show without a single woman on them. Now that hasn't fixed everything, but you can start to see the signs of progress, and it is those kind of interventionist things those measures that need to be taken. Now, sometimes on Mock the Week, there are 2 women. Yes. Frankly, I feel swamped sometimes. But you can start to see the shift in the culture.
But it's so incremental, isn't it? There's no big bang in Cat.
No.
I think the difficulty is for the broadcasters is that they've got to keep delivering. They've got to have audiences. They've got to have the income coming in. Mm-hmm. So at the moment, we're in a period of transition. But I found the session with Ian Katz yesterday really exciting. I genuinely did. I thought I could see he's halfway through doing something. And appointing people like Joe Street, who's been one of the best commissioners out of London for a long time, is just fantastic as head of daytime. What a brilliant appointment. The BBC are obviously gutted.
Well, the BBC now don't have senior commissioners. I mean, obviously Fiona Campbell is just a joy, but you don't have the senior commissioners. Craig has gone from Scotland. Joe Street's gone from Scotland. Where are the senior people that are going to be there who have both the clout and also,
What do you mean at the BBC?
Yeah.
I think what will happen, Channel 4 is brilliant because it provides genuine competition to the BBC in every way. Once the plan at Channel 4 is actually executed and we have the commissioners outside London, which is so crucial, along with the Ofcom changes when they come through, so people have actually got to create jobs outside London, which is what the law requires, then what will happen is that the BBC will have to have commissioners outside London. And obviously,
there's that one. Actually,
clearly, I'm already happening.
But actually, this whole, you must be aware of the kind of southern male white bubble that has existed.
Yes, of course.
Yeah, and so what can you do radically to change it? And what will your job? How do you, how do you reflect the whole of England to England? That because the gatekeepers are the key people, and you have utter commissioning freedom.
Yeah, I mean, I've utter commissioning freedom as long as I can get my hands in as much money as possible. But obviously, I have money and will have money. And but I think what I'm interested in is talking about what I want to do. And I think, for a start, it's about how you tell stories. So when I was in Panorama, if I can give one example, I was doing a film out of Aleppo, and I was really tired of seeing children covered in blood and dust because I thought it was a dehumanizing way of seeing people. And actually what I wanted to do was tell a story that was about resilience and see people in their homes and understand. I think you understand people better when you're not seeing a kind of a narrative which everyone's got really used to, which is quite dehumanized. And so in terms of telling stories from England and in terms of what I want to do, a different lens, different people telling them, but different people being allowed to tell them in their own way.
But different people having access to be the storytellers. I mean, we all know that one of the kind of hidden things in terms of broadcasting is class.
Yes, and so class for me is really critical. I live in Hastings. There's quite a lot of antagonism to the BBC, I would say, when I walk around and chat to people.
Right. On what basis? What do people say?
They just criticise the BBC for being metropolitan, for not really understanding what it's like to live in somewhere like Hastings. So for me, the southern white bubble thing is quite interesting because Hastings is in the south, but there are poor bits of the south as well. I don't like talking about class particularly because I don't really like differentiating people according to what, money or some kind of arbitrary. But
they don't get into the BBC or ITV or the broadcast often.
But I am going to talk about it because my kids have gone to state school. They've grown up with lots of young white kids whose parents are working 3 jobs. I do think that we could tell the stories of people who are white and working class a lot better. Everyone knows that white working class boys do incredibly badly at school, or at least a lot of them do. A lot of them sort of fall out of the educational system at 16. So, I'm interested in telling everyone's stories, but I'm interested in changing who gets to tell their stories. But I do think it's not just about BAME, it's also about class.
Cherylee.
Can I start by giving you a few statistics from my community? Because I'm from a community that goes across all those communities, and I think you're totally right, it's about changing the culture, the mindset. Because in the 80s, my community, I would have been locked up in a care home because of the amount of care I need now, support, whereas actually I'm working, I'm contributing to society. I didn't have a right to go to university when I went to university. That was disabled people had no rights to higher education until the year 2000. It was only in the 90s we had the right to get on public transport. If I was on public transport on a train in the 90s, at night I'd be in the guard's van without a light. So we've come a long way, do you know what I mean? But we're here in
the only
building.
room, in the EICC that will take a wheelchair on stage. What about that?
And this was built 20 years ago. So the thing is, we're challenging an awful lot of things, but it's getting to the critical point where I feel actually our industry, we've got a responsibility now, because there's a whole generation coming up who are educated, who are, we're fighting so many different fights, but our stories aren't on the news, we're not represented back. We're 19% of the population. 19% of the UK have a disability, physical, hidden, mental learning, all those different things, and it's never on our screens. And I do a lot of work with young disabled people, and their lives are never reflected back, which means you have no role models, and there's so richness of stories to be told. Do you know what I mean? But what we did was we came together as a load of disabled artists and set up DANC, the Disabled Artists Network Community, because on screen, 3% of representation of ITV, most of it's me. BBC, I think it's nearly 4%. When they took Family Guy off, it went down 1%. That's a cartoon. In film, we're under 1%. Do you know, why are we, disabilities across all communities, but it's not shown. And the thing is what it is, it's really interesting creatively.
Yeah. But do you think people that supposedly are able-bodied, and that's obviously completely, find it difficult to even have conversations?
We've just launched today through DANC. If you look up the hashtag label-bodied, because we set up DANC, Disabled Artists Network Community. The theory is we go into a mainstream arts organisation every 2 months, we get industry guests, we get disabled artists to come, we network, and it's a solution-focused response. So we've had 10 meetings, we've had 450 people with disabilities travel from Portsmouth, Plymouth, Glasgow, somebody flew from Canada, from Italy, because there's nothing like this. Because it's about, all the incentives are always done for us rather than led by us, and we've got that knowledge. And what I found over the 20 years of my career was people kept going, we don't know where to find you. I had 12 TV credits on my CV before I got an agent. The whole industry is a massive catch-22. So what we're trying to do as disabled artists, we come together is go, right, let's try and address all areas of the industry.
But I just want to interrupt, because you've got a great example from Russell T Davies.
Russell T Davies, from a conversation at DANC, rewrote years and years to have a disabled character, to have Ruth's character. What he did, and this is the thing, I think our industry goes, right, we need to write a disabled character. Disability isn't a personality trait. it's do you know what I mean? Stop, and this is what we've learned through DANC, is stop trying to write us, because actually write the character and we will fill it in. Do you know what I mean? I can be any of those characters, but what it will do is I have different access requirements, which means what I do will make it different. So that's the creative interest. But what Russell did was he went back to Nicola at Red and said, from this conversation with Cherylee, I want to do that. What they did then was audition loads of different disabled actresses, picked Ruth, and then Russell talked through the script with Ruth and went, where would this impact? Where do those changes need to be? And I think Mike Bartlett's just doing the same thing with Melissa Johns. And it's this ripple, because it's just... in a way, what we decided to do, we've now got a database of 450 artists where you can come and find us, come and ask us those questions. It needs to be a conversation together now, because people keep reinventing the wheel and then stop. So,
that's where you are.
That's where we
Bilaal, what about the responsibility you have, in a way that you are a gatekeeper of reflecting voices, different experiences?
I think, I find myself in a very fortunate position, especially at Al Jazeera. We actually have, 65 to 75 different nationalities working for the channel. And that kind of input that we have, from virtually every part of the world has injected us with a, completely different outlook. And I think this actually shows, on our screens. We've got, a network of about 70 bureaus that we can actually tap into. Having said that, though, the one important thing is, when it comes to commissioning, when it comes to storytelling, we've always stuck to the rule that we need to give people voices, especially the global South. When I look at bursting the Southern white bubble, the global south means something very different to us, of course. And I've heard people speak about, no, but South Africa is a third world country. I said, developing versus developed. I mean, here, just in terms of the kind of terminology that is used, and this, we need to give people those voices to put forward their understanding, their sensitivities when being on the receiving end of these kinds of terminologies.
And in terms of representation, you say you have 95 nationalities, but in terms of gender, in terms of abilities we're talking about, I mean, are you still, is that still as they say, a journey?
I think absolutely. It's always a continuous journey. If I can just break it down, the one thing is in terms, of race and nationality, the numbers that we do have, but just in terms of gender representation as well, and gender equality, I would say. The one thing is, in terms of one of our talk shows, The Stream, it's not about, we have presenters that are female. No, it's gone way beyond that. And the team, that's made up of about 15 to 20 producers, assistant producers, we broadcast, 4 times a week. They've actually taken it upon themselves to sit down and say, who are the guests we are bringing onto the show? What kind of subject matter are we dealing with? And we're going to keep count day in, day out on the numbers, on the subject matter, and in 6 months, right, we want to tally up the numbers because we want to give at least 50% screen representation, to women on the stream. And I thought that was, an excellent initiative.
And that
came from the
almost
team.
It came from the team.
Yes.
So that in terms of that's really interesting then. So that you empower them to make those decisions.
Absolutely. And I think allowing people to, not only characters on the ground to tell their stories, but allowing journalists within to have a strong voice. And I think this is extremely important because Marcus spoke about something called culture. And it's so easy to grow into a particular culture and lose what actually distinguishes you and lose your voice. Yeah. We need to be empowering the journalists, our producers, etc., to speak their minds, right? So to tell the stories that they would like to tell.
Well, that's interesting you're doing that because I wonder what you'll do, Ashley, in terms of empowering journalists. I mean, how many centres are you operating from in England to tell English stories? Who decides on the type of story and where will you actually physically be?
Can I pick up on one point about language? Because I think language is critical. How you describe people is critical. And one of the things that really annoys me, for example, is describing young black boys as gangsters and as being in gangs. And so unless you know for a fact that someone is in a criminal gang, describing groups of young black guys who live in a particular estate is a particular bugbear of mine, because and using that word immediately creates a narrative about those kids. So I do think language and how you describe things is critical and really matters to me. So in terms of what the centres that I've got, the in-house BBC offices, there's 11 of them, making current affairs around England. I've just, as of Monday, started going around to visit all of them. So they're already there, they're already making current affairs, they're all doing a very good job making investigations, and I've just come out of Panorama. I'm really pro-investigative journalism. However,
but where will those stories feature, and will it be regional?
Well, at the moment, those stories feature on, regional BBC.
And that's interesting. So regional BBC, but I wonder if you're saying that England's got to talk to each other. Yeah. Then you just don't have people from the north of England telling stories for the people in the north of England. You have people in the south of England telling stories for people from the north. Yeah.
So Kirsty, this is my job: is to take over the current portfolio, grow the amount of programmes that we are making that are going into network, create a slate which is multi-genre, because although I really champion current affairs, by its nature current affairs does tend to tell negative stories about places, and there are lots of other stories to tell. And so what I want to do...
That'll be indie-led as well, or
I absolutely want to commission indies. We're commissioning a few indies, not very many, and I absolutely want to commission small to medium-sized indies. I'm very interested in meeting anyone who's got an indie who thinks they have a story to tell from their place.
Here's a question. Why do we need BBC England, someone says?
Well, I think we need BBC England because BBC England is A, not London, So, and also BBC Scotland, BBC Wales, BBC Northern Ireland, there's a clear story coming out of those places. There's clear commissioning. There's nothing clear coming out of England, which is other than what we're making, which is current affairs. I think we need to be telling, and my brief is to tell other stories about England. England, as I said to you earlier, is the land of Shakespeare and punk rock, and there are lots of things to say about being English, which are A, not negative, B, shouldn't be accused of being nationalistic. And people in England are entitled to have a voice.
Marcus, in terms of people that are on boards that are making decisions, committees, is there still, in that sense, an elite? If you think about all the different industry boards, RTS, Creative Cities Convention, all these different ones, is there a bias, do you think, towards white?
Do I need to take a photograph? Like seriously? Of course, when you go to BAFTA, when you go to the RTS Awards, don't look at the people on stage who are picking up the awards. Look at the audience, because it's the audience where the networking is happening and where the industry players really are in the audience.
Kat?
I think there is a big difference between the RTS, and BAFTA. So the RTS has centres throughout the country, large centres. I'm the chair of the North West, and I've been on the committee for 10 years before becoming chair a couple of years ago. And the RTS is honestly representative of the whole country. It's BAFTA that's the problem with, and BAFTA, they have their meetings, because I was talking to somebody who was standing recently for their committee, and obviously because I'm a BAFTA judge and I do get invited to stand, but all the meetings happen at 7 o'clock at night in central London, and so it's not possible for people out of London to be on the BAFTA committee, and therefore BAFTA, I think, really have to ask themselves if they're representative. And I personally think if I was to set up, I don't know, some other kind of awards, the kind of British awards, but actually it's all happening in Manchester. All my judging panels are in Manchester. Maybe we'll invite a couple of Scousers across. But, then I think those awards would be mocked, quite rightly, as national awards. So how can BAFTA, with kind of, without having kind of representation, making sure they've got representation on each judging panel, genuinely say that they're representing the country?
Yeah, not to have an RTS love-in, but, I was chair for the RTS Diversity Committee for, I think it was six years, maybe longer, feels longer. So yeah, RTS has done and continues to do some really good stuff around diversity.
But it is in terms of who gets access to commissioners and whose story gets to be told. It was so interesting yesterday, Louisa saying in the question time session that, what is the point of having a meeting at 9 o'clock in London where you've got to get a peak time train,
They launched Channel
which costs a
4.
freaking fortune?
They launched Channel 4 9:30 in the morning in central London. And I arrived having got up really, really ridiculous red-eye early. I couldn't even get a seat. There weren't enough seats. And they said to me, and I said, I've paid 180 quid to be here. I had to really fight to actually get a seat.
But forget about the formal commissioning, all right? My little anecdote is that I love to run marathons. I do park runs. Does everyone know what a park run is? It's a little 5K. Okay, I do park runs. And I did a park run when I was in London, near my mum's house, which is near Parliament Hill. Okay, I then had a meeting, or not meeting, actually had a coffee with a friend who's a TV exec. He said, where have you come from? I said, I come from a Park Hill, from Parliament Hill. He said, very clever. Oh, yeah. And I was like, what are you going on about? He goes, oh, yeah, all the TV execs, all the commissioners, when they do park runs, they do the Parliament Hill, Kenwood House park run, right? And so it's the informal park runs, it's the informal meetings, it's all the informal stuff, right, which adds up. Every time I came down to London when I was in Scotland, it was for a formal commission. The commissioner knows that I'm coming to try and pitch something to him or her, right? And so the defences are up. Whereas when you're just chilling at Edinburgh Television Festival, or when you're just chilling
in Soho House,
or 10 o'clock at night, and people have had a little bit of alcohol, that's when the commissioning gets a little bit easier. So it's also about, and this is also comes into your point with regards to class, it's who are your social groups?
Yeah.
Where a lot of that, maybe not deliberately, but a lot of those commissions are taking place, a lot of that business is taking place.
Well, my social groups are not Soho House.
Here's a question. While some audiences remain predominantly underserved and unreflected, should UK audiences be paying licence fees? Yeah, good point. Nish?
Yes. I still think the BBC. I still think that the BBC is one of the things it's worst at is arguing for the things it does well. And I think it is rightly subject to more scrutiny than any other broadcaster. But I think in terms of this argument about the licence fee, I mean, it's a good deal. You know, like the licence fee in general still constitutes exceptional value for money in terms of the output that you get. Now, in terms of...
If people don't feel reflected on the programmes that are being shown, being commissioned, being made, should there be some kind of change in that?
I mean, I think that would be very difficult to administrate. I mean, you know, I haven't watched Years and Years yet, but I still think I should my licence fee should go towards it. Like, I'm not sure that you can make it work like that. What you have to do is fight to make the organisation more representative. I mean, in terms of, I think I feel very defensive of the BBC because I feel like there's a lot of conversation about should we pay the licence fee, should we take the licence fee away? You know, it's an organisation that exists for all of us, and it's incumbent on all of us to try and fight and.
But do you think the
changes
BBC has got the best lens it could have for telling stories? I mean, obviously, Ashley, I know you're going to be changing that, but do you think? I mean, because I know, I mean, on Newsnight we try incredibly hard. In terms of gender, in terms of ethnic diversity on television. It is incredibly hard to do sometimes. And we do our very best, but I think there must be other ways of getting these voices on television.
Just very, very quickly, I wanted to
and
mention...
behind the cameras as well.
Yeah, in terms of behind the cameras, what I was going to talk about, commissioners. Yes. One thing the BBC's done brilliantly recently is employ commissioners with disabilities. So I work with Julie Shaw for BBC Daytime, fantastic commissioner, and also with Kate Ansell, brilliant commissioner in Specialist Factual. And they've really made a difference, particularly, actually, Kate Ansell, in terms of the lens, because she really challenges whenever we're tackling anything about disability, people with disabilities on Songs of Praise. She's really brilliant at it.
Can I just add to that as well? It's something that we've been doing, Marcus Wilson. It's exactly that. He's set up a commitment. And he's already got 50 Fathom Films, BFI are interested, Tom BBC North has said they will, ITV has said they will, and the idea is to commit to auditioning actors with disabilities for every episode, and it's also about behind the screen scenes talent as well. They set up on the A Word a 5-week paid placement for 5 production staff with disabilities through DANC, and overnight from our database he said he had 50 people he could then employ. So the people are there, we now have a central resource of where to find them, and it's just about rippling it out exactly what you're saying.
Bilaal, you were saying that you're going to monitor over 6 months, and I think it'd be incredibly interesting to come back to the television festival this time next year and see how things change because of what your teams actually came up with. But I wonder, how do you actually monitor change, Marcus? How do you actually make sure it's happening and happening consistently?
By being as open as possible with the statistics.
Right.
You know, so there's a few statistical fallacies which are going on about. Everyone looks at Channel 4 statistics and think they're absolutely BME statistics and think they're absolutely wonderful. But at the same time, what you're really comparing Channel 4, because it's a publishing house, is you're comparing it to the BBC's DG office. Yeah. And so they both run at about 20%. So the Channel 4 is not really doing, when it comes to BAME diversity, any better than the BBC. If you actually compare like with like, you look at the BBC's disability stats, they were at 3%. Then in 2016, they jumped to 8%. They more than double in 1 year. All right, and that's because the BBC changed how it actually defines disability and then sent out a new survey to survey people. And so what we need with regards to that is, with regards to monitoring diversity, is that we need to be open, and it needs to be open to the public as to our definitions.
Can I just quickly say that we can all, I mean, we are all here at a television conference, and we can talk a lot about how the television industry, things can change. The real truth is that the reason that these industries are struggling with diversity is because over the last 10 years, you can only really work in these industries if you are independently wealthy. Yeah. Like, that is the reason. If you talk about the Southern White Bubble, the reason it's been exacerbated in the last 10 years is with the government's austerity programme and with the cuts to public funding for arts programmes, it makes it harder and harder and creates an intern culture. And that is the kind of monster that keeps feeding itself.
There should be no interns unpaid.
Yeah, 100%.
100%, living wage.
But also, we require a whole systemic change, and we need to look at the public funding that goes into the arts, because the truth is people can't afford to do a fucking Edinburgh show anymore.
Yeah.
You know, and
accommodation, everything.
It's everything. It's an entire systemic cultural change that needs to take place if you want a more diverse and representative media.
Well, it's interesting because just the British Independent Film Awards and Screen Skills last year and an unconscious bias training scheme. Can we all encourage everyone to take up an unconscious bias training scheme? Ashing.
Yeah, I mean, I've been spending £50 a day commuting into London from Hastings for years, and that's only possible because I was being paid enough money to do that. But if you're actually trying to work in London, interns coming in to me, I always insisted that they had to be paid. That is an absolutely critical barrier to trying to work in the industry. When I went into London Weekend Television, I was unpaid, but I was living in a squat. So, you know, that's how, when I went to a polytechnic, lived in a squat, and managed to sort of push my way into the television business. It's incredibly hard to do that now.
Let's put the lights up so we can get some questions. I'm dying to hear from questions.
Really quickly, I'm really sorry. There's no empirical evidence that unbiased conscious training actually works.
Right.
There's some evidence that there's actual moral licensing, and moral licensing is when you think you've actually done something worthy, you then feel you don't have to do something worthy in another area. And there's actually evidence that when people have taken that training, they actually become more prejudiced afterwards. Right? So we need to be really careful about unconscious bias.
I just want to mention about work experience. I've had 1,000 people through my business on work experience. We only ever do 1 week placements. We don't pay them. We might pay some expenses, but it's only for 1 week. But the difference is that we're in Manchester, and I've employed a lot of people that have come through on work experience. So sometimes, you know, people from London, they'll say, "Oh, do you pay your people?" But I'm in Manchester. That's what's different. You know, young people in Manchester are getting a chance to get into the industry. And with this kind of total London focus that's gone on in recent years, it makes it absolutely impossible. We had a series, you know, in Manchester, you know, a couple of years ago, where they brought the runners up from London. You know, it was crazy. And we know, don't we, this wonderful woman, Rose Marley, who runs a social action programme, and she trains runners in Manchester. And you can actually employ them. It's people on demand. You can employ them for the hour if you want. You can employ them for 2 hours. They're brilliantly trained, and they all get, you know, a good living wage.
And don't get me wrong, Kat, I'm not saying people shouldn't do work experience. It just got to the point where people were being brought in for months at a time.
Excuse me, exploited. The BBC should never not be paying anyone.
There was a story on a big national programme, I can't say the name of it, but I was working on it as a producer in the 90s. There was a guy on work experience for 12 months unpaid. He was not given a job, and he took his own life. And that's why when I set my company up in 2007, I had a rule, and this was before the BBC brought in the same rule, that I would never not pay anybody. Do you know what I mean? If they were doing
but also in a world where so many people are freelance, it's so risky. And this anecdotal stuff that we were preparing for this session, which was, you know, black and disabled directors say they're considered risky, where white males are hired on their potential. Now, the idea that atmosphere exists, mean that people can't take the risk of moving somewhere when they're going to be looked at and thought, well, I'm too risky.
Well, we're assumed that we cost more, and we don't tend to. I know, so disabled people try so hard to get in. I've never had a day off, Corrie, in my life, in 10 years, and my skeleton dislocates all the time. But that's usual to me. So in a way, you're going to get people who've pushed and pushed. And I think that's the same from a lot of communities. If you've been so desperate to do something, and you know you have to try harder and harder to prove yourself, because you have to prove more against.
But it's such an indictment that you have to keep pushing. I mean,
but that's the reality, and that's fine, because I'm happy. I'm doing my career I want. But I think everybody in this room needs to probably go, let me pledge something today. Let me not just listen and go, you know, let's make pledges. Let's get
some questions from the audience. I mean, yes, right in the front here. Let's get a mic too. Could you keep your hand up just so that it comes? Great. And tell us who you are if you wish.
Hi, I'm Vincent. Thank you so much for this talk and for these structural solutions. I was wondering a question, which is, it's also not just lack of representation, it's also people getting vilified. And how to regain the trust of the communities get routinely vilified on British television. I'm specifically thinking of the trans community that has to debate its very rights and existence. I'm thinking of this festival inviting speakers that say that trans women aren't women, and that is glossed over and completely accepted and not challenged. What is the TV industry going to commit to regain that trust? Well, why shouldn't we seek out alternative networks like the internet?
Sorry?
I was saying, why shouldn't we seek out alternative networks like the internet?
Yeah. well, I mean, the internet it is a place where there is going to be a lot of stories told. But that's interesting in that whole idea of the trans debate is something, obviously, that you'll be covering, presumably, on BBC England.
Yeah, I mean, it's being covered all the time, but it's not being covered necessarily in ways that everybody is always happy with. And I think all we can do is try our best to tell stories about people which are not sort of sitting above them, telling our version of their story, but allowing them to tell theirs.
I mean, it's different in your own area. It's different. There are different constraints upon you than perhaps there would be. For example, here's a question about, can broadcasters move away from being binary to talking about all genders? And I wonder, in your physical territory where you are, is that harder? Is it harder for you, Bilaal?
I mean, one of the issues that I just want to jump back to what Nish was talking about, and I see myself slightly as an outsider here because the discussion has, been primarily about UK television. What I would like to put forward in terms of a little bit of experience is, my experience in South Africa in particular. And it started with education and training and access to education and training. So if you're looking for the skills and you need to find those skills, do the, communities do they have access to university education, the kind of skills training, etc. When it comes to indies, when it comes to independent production companies, are we setting aside quotas? We've got something in South Africa called Black Economic Empowerment. And here it was set up essentially to redress the apartheid system, so the injustices of the past. If you've got a system that is seriously out of balance, you need to put in particular steps in place to correct that balance, and without actually resorting to reverse apartheid in any sort of form.
Here's a question. Broadcasters create heads of diversity positions that have no real mandate or power. What does the panel suggest should be the structural changes to address? I mean, I think diversity is a really weird word anyway. It is representation, but what is a head of diversity meant to do, Kat? They have no real mandate or power.
I agree. I think it's all about commissioners. I feel really bad because I hadn't mentioned Kes Margery, who's another commissioner who uses wheelchair that we work with all the time. And she sent me an email at 12 o'clock last night, midnight. And I had to actually say to her, Kes, you have to stop working now. We're going to sleep, And that's what she's like. She's incredibly hardworking. And I think it's about empowering commissioners, especially out of London, so that they can tell, Kes is based in Media City, that they can tell stories with that different lens. We'll get people to work with them telling stories. And that's what it's about. These head of diversity roles, it's box ticking, I'm afraid. Yeah. And it's very frustrating because, one of my best producers, Colin Stone, he has been with us since one of the first diversity schemes that was a Granada scheme back in kind of 1991 or something. He's brilliant, but, the problem is that many people don't survive. It's a kind of revolving door. They come in on a scheme, they go out. Should we be setting up a kind of training scheme for white London, men? We wouldn't dream of doing it, and yet that's what happens all the time. It's like, let's do another diversity training scheme. Yeah. Let's just give them jobs. Let's just employ people. That's what we do, Anyone
on that from the audience? Question on that? I mean, who has actually heard of a head of diversity that's actually done anything?
To be honest, though, we have had conversations like Addy at ITV has been brilliant, Miranda Wayland, who is ITV to BBC now. And I think it is because sometimes it's one individual fighting everybody else, and that's what's difficult. And I think it's about what I always try and do is create legacy. Don't do something which hasn't got a legacy. Don't create a scheme that then the people are dropped. Making sure that's the next 3 steps. Because my generation, because I'm 45, I wasn't allowed in the room. Do you know what I mean? I'd be auditioning. I auditioned in Leicester Square. I'd turn up places. They'd be up 3 flights of stairs. I'd be auditioning in the hallway, in the road. The generation below me, who I'm working with now, feel like they've got a bit more rights, but they've been on so many schemes, so many training schemes, but never taken any further. And then people are going, well, let's find the new people. Let's look at finding new people, but then also people who've been trained.
Yes. Here's a question. There are lots of diverse people coming into the industry at lower levels, but how do we keep them in the fold without them getting frustrated at the bubble? Marcus, I mean, I'm actually sure that this is, it's an anonymous question. But I think the idea is that, you can bring people in, but unless, as you say, you promote them, keep them, It means nothing. It is simply box ticking, and I have seen it happen.
Retention is a massive problem. I sometimes overquote BBC stats, but it's only because BBC stats are so much better than every other broadcaster. Right? But the retention rate of disabled people and ethnic minorities are at a lower rate than their white, able-bodied counterparts. Right? So when you actually look at the fact that BME diversity has gone up, questionably, at the BBC, right? More BME people are actually leaving at a faster rate. I'm only quoting BBC stats, not because I want to bash the BBC, just their stats are really good. And if other people followed their example, I would gladly use ITV stats and Channel 4 stats. But in 2016, the number of BME people that were leaving the industry, leaving the BBC, was 14.6%, which was a higher rate than their white counterpart. Right? This year, 18.2%. So more BME people are leaving at a faster rate now than they were 4 years ago. Right?
But would a diversity head help stop that?
Yeah.
Are they useful in your view, these heads of diversity?
A diversity head, or what's really interesting is that just when everybody that's talked has talked about money and power, right? So we've talked about structural change, right? And whether things need to be structurally put into place, right? We've talked about commissioning power and with regards to England. We've talked about quotas when we're talking about comedy and women. When we talk about regionality, we're talking about how much money, how you define regionality, which I know is something which you have talked about, and also how much money is actually earmarked and ring-fenced for that. Right? So the head of diversity, if they were empowered with money...
But then they'd be a commissioner, wouldn't they?
Not necessarily. Kenny McCoy, head of Scotland, was not a commissioner, but he had real money and real power. So
but that was such an anomaly in a way for the BBC, wasn't it? I mean, then there was lots of reasons for that, not least a broader political agenda in terms of how the BBC felt about Scotland.
There is a way of setting it up.
But how do you change the face of the big bosses? That's the thing. You can say it percolates around here, but you just said yourself, when it actually comes to going like that to the pyramid looks terribly unrepresentative.
This is what we're doing in Dank, it's a conversation. It's about having the conversation, but it's also exactly what you say, put some money into it. Put some money behind the change, because otherwise all these people are scrabbling around trying to make these changes, but they can't give anything, you can't put anything cement or concrete into place because there's no money behind that diversity shift.
I mean, I would argue that my face is not the same as the face of a typical, or what someone maybe would see as someone typical. I am white, but I am female, I am older female, I am a single mother, I do live out of London. You know, I think people like me, I know Fiona, who's a very good friend of mine, cares enormously about representation. She and I are going to work together out of Birmingham as often as we can. You know, it's about putting people in place who actually give a shit. I do give a shit, so does she.
This is a good, that's why it should just be, everybody in this room gives a shit. That would actually be a good start. Great to see Channel 4 in Leeds, but can those at the top lobby government for better rail transport infrastructure so regional production is sustainable? This business is about being sustainable, but of course we're about to hear if we're going to get HS3, which is going to put together Leeds and Manchester, which would be terrific, of course.
It would be terrific, but you know what? I just wish some of the news organisations would actually interview engineers, because it looks like Boris is going to basically not do HS2. And some of the trains now, they're relying on Victorian technology, you know, the West Coast line. And that investment in infrastructure has got to happen. And I know, you know, he's kind of saying, oh, well, it shouldn't all be about London. But to be honest, unfortunately, in a lot of industries, and ours still, you know, all the commissioners are in London. But I go to all the different conferences, you know, and open days and everything. And I do think the faces of commissioners are changing. You know, I think it's brilliant we have disabled commissioners, as I said. Brilliant that, you know, in every channel now, there are more commissioners from different backgrounds. And what Channel 4 is doing in terms of moving out of London is incredibly positive.
It is,
and the Ofcom changes as well.
Yeah, and actually, Channel 4 moving to Leeds, the fact that 90% of the commissioners will not necessarily move because they don't want to leave London for lots of very good reasons. I mean, presumably there's an opportunity to hire a whole raft of different kinds of commissioners.
I don't think 90%. I mean, whoever, you know, it doesn't, like you say, it doesn't really matter. But I mean, I think that he's got commissioners in place in all the centres, and that's the key, because as you were saying, it's all about relationships. If it's a London club, we don't have the relationships, and therefore we're selling as a kind of outsider. And so the idea is that knowing it's an informal industry about relationships, you've got to have commissioners, outside London, around the...
And I don't want Channel 4 to be the only game in town up in Leeds. I've got relationships already there, and I want to have more.
Yeah.
But but if somebody wants to come and pitch an idea to you and you're peripatetic, it's just to email you, say, I'm going to be in...
I'll go to them.
I'm going to be in Thirsk. I'm doing
it already. I'm doing it already. I'm saying I'm going to be in Leeds. I'm going to be in Salford. I'm going to be in Plymouth. Come and meet me.
Yeah.
Can I also just say, like, in terms of the idea that we are speaking to people who are all committed to this idea, part of the problem in terms of breaking out of these bubbles is it's all very well and good for us to say this to you because these people all agree. And part of the problem is these conversations are often very cyclical. They're spoken by people who have an interest to people who already have an interest. And my big idea is we should have done this and build it as Hugh Laurie live. Yeah. Because the problem is that these messages aren't going to the people at the top because they don't fucking turn up.
Well, let's see, because you're such a beautiful and brilliant audience. Let's see how many senior commissioners from the broadcasters are in the room. Only one on the panel. But actually, in this case, it's definitely quality rather than quantity.
Thank you, Kirsty.
Just before we finish, any other questions from the floor? I've got a couple on the app. I just want to make sure if anyone actually wants to have a conversation from the floor. Let me see, I've got another one. As a trainee casting researcher, I was tasked with getting more BAME and disability, but not given any tools or training to help. Is there a failure at that level? Exactly what we're talking about, Cherylee.
That's why we're trying to set up, we got UK Faster building us a private LinkedIn for that particular reason, and that's why I've got information about this commitment that Marcus is setting up if anybody wants to come and distribute it or commit to it. Because the thing is, there's always those catch-22s. You need to have a central resource. If you want to make all these shifts, you then need to enable everybody in the industry to know how to find these people or to enable train. All the different things need to have those gear shifts. But yes, that's why we're getting a central resource for disabled artists and actors before we then get everybody to sign to the commitment gets launched. Because otherwise you're creating these problems.
Okay, and there's one final one, which is a kind of more general one, I suppose, for general employment. How do the panel think we can move away from long hours culture that pushes so many people out of television? Let's park that. And let's get this one that's just disappeared from my screen here to Nish. Because we all know about the long hours culture. There was one other one here came up and it's disappeared. So can the technical person give me that one back to finish?
Well.
The one for
silenced.
Nish is being silenced here. Can we just put Nish's back up here? For Nish. We don't see much Asian talent on our screens. What's been your experience as an Asian male on primetime TV?
Pretty solid stuff. I got the job that I got because no one else wanted it. Originally, they wanted someone higher profile for the MASH report, and none of them wanted to do the job. We sort of got commissioned on a slight weird fluke. My experience is, things are improving. The sort of, there was a time where it was, I spoke to Sanjeev Bhaskar about this about a couple of years ago, and he was saying that he expected that Goodness Gracious Me would immediately open the doors for lots of young British Asian comedians to come through. But it's taken this long for it to percolate through because I think that was a generation that needed to be young enough to have the time to make the decision to get into this. So it's only just, the Goodness Gracious Me effect is now, I think, only filtering through into comedy. And so you're seeing people like me and Ramesh and Tez and Sindhu starting to sort of move through. But I mean, I think when you're like all minority ethnic backgrounds, you're subjected to a weird level of scrutiny in terms of
This is what we're talking about.
Well, there were moments in my career where I could have, if I hadn't had no other discernible skills, I probably would have stopped. And I only kept going because I couldn't do anything else. When I was starting as a comedian, there was an agent who I don't know, maybe still works in the industry, but who told me that I would never amount to anything in comedy because I refused to do an Asian accent in an audition because I felt that it was exploitative and cheap. And she said that I would never understand what modern Britain wants. Now, in another person...
You need to do a Dorothy. No,
Yeah, I can. Her
Name,
name's
name.
Olivia Woodward. She still works at Curtis Brown. Like, she still works in the industry. Like, she's still got a job. But if I was that could have easily put me off from continuing.
Absolutely.
Like, that could
What
completely
and our
deflated
screens
me.
would be much less rich for.
Well, citation needed. I appreciate. but you know, that's the sort of thing when you talk about people leaving the industry from different backgrounds. That's exactly the sort of feedback that would stop people from working.
Ladies and gentlemen, please thank our panel very much for this session. Thank you very much.